From being the fuel of the earliest civilizations to being humans' primary source of calories for thousands of years, bread has definitely ingrained itself in the human culture and history. Today, on a show about stuff, we're going to talk more about the history and science of bread, as well as what the flour making industry looks like today. So stay tuned.
Bread on. Now go!
Archaeological findings trace the existence of cereals and early forms of bread up to 30,000 years ago. The closest ancestor to modern-day bread would be a mix of crushed grains made from a quern and water to create gruel, sometimes heated up to create an early form of flatbread, most closely resembled by tortillas or chapatis. So after the Ice Age, when grasses became easier to find, someone found out that if you left your gruel out for a while, it began to bubble, and if you cooked it, you got a nice sour dough. Since we had discovered bread, it started a chain reaction that led to towns and cities. Since to feed a lot of people, you need a lot of grain, this led to agricultural and crop domestication, but humans aren't strong enough to do all of that work. We need oxen and plows, and donkeys for mills, hence the beginning of domestication of animals and slavery. Now, let's cut to Egypt, considered to be the granary of the world, where they harvested good quality wheat, and it was the first recorded use of animals and tools for this harvesting process. This was also when the first organized bakeries started popping up, where they would bake bread in a clay oven instead of bowls and hot stones like the peasants. And on top of grains, they added fruits and flowers like dates and coriander. At this point, there were two ways to make bread. Either skim a little bit off the top of your beer and add it to your bread dough, or save a little bit of your bread dough and add it next time you make bread, or what we now call a sourdough starter. So what Egyptian rulers figured out, since bread was so easy to make and energy rich, you could use it to feed an entire workforce, slaves, who could then build ginormous buildings and make even more food, a model that was followed for millennia up until very recently. In fact, bread baking bowls are the most common items found in the Egyptian slave quarters. When the Hebrew people fled in the book of Exodus, they brought their bread baking bowls, but couldn't wait for the bread to rise and abandoned their sourdough starters, leading to matzo. But it wasn't just slaves being fed bread. Both workers and senior officials were often paid in bread as it was so common. In fact, carefully shaped bread was often found in tombs and graves. And there, the Greeks picked up bread making from the Egyptians, and they invented modern bread ovens with preheating indoors. Athenaeus in the Learned Banquet refers up to 72 different types of bread, sweetbreads, biscuits, wheat breads, and the first pizza, a round flatbread where they placed vegetables, herbs, and cheese, known as placuntas. From the Greeks, Romans picked up bread making. The Romans loved their bread, so much that every household got 75 pounds of grain per month from the government, and under Emperor Trajan, there were up to 300 organized bakeries in Rome and the creation of the first Bakers' Guild. As the poet Juvenal said, "Give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt." Real handy when slaves make up 90% of your population. Under the Romans, bread making became almost this art form, a status symbol, with white bread being considered as higher quality and for the elites. From that, the Romans, or now the Byzantines, started developing pastry making, primarily with honey and pomegranate syrup. Later, bread making caught on in medieval Europe, where feudalism was very common. This is where serfs worked on farms all day harvesting grain, only to give most of that to their lords. And since they didn't own their own bread baking ovens, they had to go to the Lord Baker to bake their bread, who also took a cut. This didn't last long though, because during the French Revolution, people were using half their income to buy bread, and the average Frenchman would eat up to 3 pounds of bread per day. They would often revolt if the bread was bad quality, so it was a problem when there was a shortage of bread, which led to the French Revolution. That's right, a bread shortage is what led to 17,000 people's heads being chopped off at the guillotine. At this point, people didn't really know how bread was made. They knew when you put these things together, this happens, but they didn't know how it was made. Until 1840, Louis Pasteur discovered, yeast was a fungus, and that's what made bread rise. It would get into the sourdough starters that people left out and feed on the flour and sugar, and basically fart, which made the bread rise. This was perfect because in the mid-1800s, the world experienced industrialization and a large population boom. All these factory workers would need a lot more bread, and faster than the days of the old sourdough process that took days before. So baker's yeast was invented. This, along with the development of windmills and steel rollers, led for bread to continue to be the primary food source for many people. In fact, every population boom came along with some bread-related innovation. Post-World War I saw the rise of mechanized bread slicing, and post-World War II with the baby boom led to people taking bread, a 3 or 4 ingredient process, and pumping it full of chemicals until it became Wonder Bread. On the bright side though, pastry making was largely advanced upon during the Industrial Revolution with the invention of croissant, tiramisu, ciabatta, panettone, crepes, brioche, baguettes, and cake. Now to our science corner. There are a couple main components in bread. Most recipes that aren't factory made include some or all of these ingredients, all of which contribute to the bread making process. First, the yeast. If you're using dehydrated yeast or baker's yeast, you want to hydrate it in water. Like we talked before, yeast is actually a fungus. It makes the bread rise by consuming glucose or other carbohydrates from the dough mixture and producing ethanol and carbon dioxide. These gases get trapped in the dough, causing it to rise. This is what proofing is, leaving the dough out to rise and letting it fart out the gas. That's why you get little pockets whenever you look at bread. Next, the oil. Other recipes may use butter or lard, but they have the same basic job of making bread soft and preventing the water from escaping during baking. Next, the sugar. This acts as fuel for the yeast during fermentation. When the sugar is heated, it goes through this thing called the Maillard reaction, or non-enzymatic browning. This occurs when sugar reacts with amino acids and is responsible for flavors and aromas that come off the toast, seared steak, and other foods. So white table sugar breaks up into sucrose and fructose, which are reducing sugars. This means they give some of their electrons to other molecules. When heated up, their tendency to give electrons to other molecules leads to totally new compounds, introducing different flavors into, in this case, the crust of the bread. Next, the salt. While making the bread taste better, it also helps shield charged gluten molecules from one another without the salt. The gluten molecules get really close together, and we don't want that, so the salt helps stabilize the dough. Next, the flour. This provides the structure of the bread, and the yeast feed off the glucose and flour, and the water in the mixture activates proteins in the bread to form gluten, a mixture of water and soluble proteins, which make up the bread. Gluten molecules are central to the structure of the bread. They form hydrogen bonds and disulfide bonds with each other, creating a gluten network throughout the dough. This is why making gluten-free bread is so hard. You can't just substitute gluten-free flour for normal flour, because the gluten is a very central part of the reactions that make bread bread. Next, kneading the dough. This is one of the most important parts of bread making, and what makes the bread so fluffy. Because when you stretch and knead the dough, the gluten can create more hydrogen bonds with adjacent proteins, making it smooth and fluffy. Next, the proofing or rising. As a general rule, the hotter the air temperature, the faster the yeast will ferment. There's a reason you don't make bread super warm, so the bread is done quicker though, and this is because the central flavor of the bread comes from the yeast fermenting, and most of the good flavor comes long after the yeast have exhausted their oxygen supply. Also, if the temperature is too hot, the yeast will inflate the dough faster than the gluten can organize, because gluten isn't as temperature sensitive as yeast. This will cause the yeast bubbles to pop, ruining the shape. This doesn't really matter though if you're just making bread at home, but the reason things like New York pizza dough taste so good is because it spent a lot of time proofing in the fridge. After proofing the bread, it about doubles in size. Then you punch down the dough to let out the excess CO2 and shape it, and then bake it. This is where the Maillard reaction happens, like we talked about before. This was all a pretty simple explanation of the science of bread making, but I think this graph sums it all up pretty well. Pause the video if you want to get a better look at it. Now, I've left out a lot, but since bread is so complicated and so central to human history, people have a real connection to it, and you can get really into bread baking. And it's an art in itself, combining different things in dough to make certain flavors. Most of us, though, including myself, we don't really think about how wheat is grown, flour is milled, and the bread is made anymore, and that's a privilege we have, food being readily available in restaurants and supermarkets for purchase. So let's learn more about the behind the scenes of the making of flour. I reached out to David at Capay Mills to learn more about how flour is made.
Basically, I'm running two businesses. I've got a growing side and I've got a milling side. And my interest initially was on the growing side. The fact is, you need acreage in order to grow grains, and you need a lot of money to get into it. If you're not inheriting a farm, you better be independently wealthy if you want to start this business on any kind of commercial scale. And grain's always been a staple. It was the first cultivated crop. It represented somewhere around 60% of our calories as humans for the past 10,000 years. As a species, it was kind of our primary source of nutrition and calories, so it's incredibly important. But what's happened is it's also become the ultimate commodity. where low price and productivity has become the absolute goal of the whole industry. The cheaper the flour, kind of the figuring is the better, to the exclusion of nutrition, to the exclusion of sustainable agricultural practices, to the exclusion of economic sustainability on the producers, so that most grain growers at this point grow at a loss. It's very difficult to make any kind of money, unless you've got 20,000 acres that are grown on a purely industrial scale. And even then, I think it's very challenging to earn a living doing this. People, I think the public doesn't realize how industrialized our food production is, our primary source of calories being cereals and flour, and everything that represents breads and cookies and all the permutations of wheat and grain within the system we have. That wasn't how it used to be until quite recently. Up until at least the 50s, even the 60s, we still had an agricultural economy based on distributed resources, based on smaller scale production that frankly was more resilient to things like climate change, more resilient to things like, crop loss due to rust or smut, fungal infections, that kind of thing. You can lose whole areas of crops that if everybody's growing the same variety on, 20,000 acre farms, you lose everything. And if you have more diversity, smaller scale, you've got a lot better chance of surviving that thing. And then conversely, to protect against that at the scale we're working requires a lot of chemicals, a lot of herbicides, a lot of fungicides, a lot of input that by nature cereals don't normally require that. They're pretty tough plants as they go and are not that prone to disease except by the way we grow it. So there are a lot of implications for the industrialization of cereal production. And as people learn about it, they'll understand better what the trade-offs are. Why do we have an epidemic of obesity? Why do we have an epidemic of diabetes? Why do we have? Why is the U.S. going down in a lot of health indicators in terms of longevity and all sorts of factors that I think are primarily a result of the industrialization of food. And we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater when we industrialized the process. And, I think it's time to go back and look at some of the aspects of prior systems that were beneficial, that did allow, as I said, for smaller communities to exist. And the industry has built, has made it where commodity flour, commercial flour, selling point for it is that it's cheap, and the next is that it's consistent. And grain is a crop. It's not consistent. It's going to vary from variety to variety of wheat, and from field to field, and from year to year. And it's no different from anything else that grows in the ground. It's not consistent. And because the industry has been so focused on people want it to be the same thing they're working with every time they buy a bag of flour, you don't want it changing every time. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the door to make that consistent. And that includes a lot of additives. It includes a lot of blending. You're making this stuff as anonymous as it can be, because you start looking at the differences between wheat varieties. They're very different from each other. And the way that, wine grapes, the difference between a Merlot and a Pinot Noir and Zinfandel and a Cabernet, anybody that is into wine will realize there's huge differences in those different varieties, and they look for those differences. Wine was once a commodity. When I was a kid, you buy a gallon jug of wine, and it was kind of red and anonymous, and it blended from God knows what went in there. And people started discovering, hey, it's a lot more interesting when you start enjoying the differences and the varieties as a whole new aspect of this, in wine's term, this beverage we've been drinking. it's the same with grains and flour for food. I don't want to make flours that are consistent. I want to make flours that are really different from each other, and I don't know what this year, we're harvesting right now. I have no idea what the quality of the crop is going to be like until I get it tested and until I do some baking with it. And it's going to be different from last year, I guarantee you. And that's part of the fun, it's for me. And to maintain the kind of prices we pay, not just for flour, but for most of our food, most of our healthy food, let's put it that way. To produce that is going to be more expensive than something coming out of a machine, from an industrialized process where you can throw whatever you throw into it, flip a switch, and out pops a bunch of Doritos that is cheap because you're taking people out of the process, you're mechanizing everything. And my flour's expensive. I know that. It's a challenge. I want to try to produce something that people can use. I don't want a precious, exclusive kind of gourmet whatever that nobody can afford to use. But it's hard. I sell some flour to a group in Los Angeles who's selling in South Central LA, and I know that folks on a budget, especially now with this COVID thing, people who aren't working, there's no way they can afford to pay what it costs me to produce my flour. It's really hard. But one thing I do, I ask my customers, I say, look, can you help offset the cost for folks that can't afford it? And people are really generous. At farmers markets, they decide how much they add on to the price of the flour that I sell, and that gets sent down to this group in LA to help reduce the cost for people who have fewer resources, so that hopefully they can afford to eat healthily and make food that tastes good for their family and that is nutritious for their kids. And if that's what it takes, then we've got to figure out systems to make, to share those costs so that those that can afford it help those who can't to access this stuff. I love driving across the country and have such a hard time seeing, small towns that are abandoned because the means of production, the social structures and the economic structures were thrown away, were been replaced by Walmarts and Costco's and God knows this Amazon, these systems that do nothing to bring communities together. And I think that growing grains, milling flour, it seems pretty mundane, but I also think that was kind of the glue that once kept these communities together. And when we lost that capacity to be able to do that, we lost more than the idea of locally milled and produced flour. We lost a whole model that enables smaller towns to exist. And who knows, maybe someday we can bring back a little more of that idea. And I don't believe I'm ever going to, what I'm doing is it's not an either or. It's never going to replace the commodity system. That's here to stay. I think being able to offer an alternative, though, is important. I think that they're parallel and they may even complement each other. And we can step it back a bit where commodity scale ag coexists with smaller local scale production, and where it can be affordable in a way that people can afford to eat, healthy, seasonal, minimally processed foods, along with less expensive commodity produced foods. And think that, look at this whole COVID thing, everybody's into baking and making bread now. And people are realizing it's not just feeding your family, but it's relaxing, and it's something you can do with your kids, and it's very similar to the whole microbrew wave that I watched happen. I don't know when did that start, in the 1980s or something. And now that's the major trend in the industry. People are buying here Sierra Nevada instead of Budweiser, And, it's a lot of small brewers getting involved with that, and they're buying more and more local products, and it's a better product. It's a more interesting and flavorful and everything else. Same thing goes on with breads and flour, and it would be great to see it, on the shelf alongside Gold Medal and, Bob's Red Mill and, other large-scale millers, to see little local mills on the shelf alongside that. And it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to be a premium product, and it's going to be something different, but they'll coexist, and that would be, that's my dream to see.